Hey guys, this is Jan for Chess24. We continue our coverage of the FIDE Grand Prix, where Fabiano Caruana won in the third round against Yevgeny Tomaszewski, took the lead in the tournament, and in the fourth round he is facing the French number one, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, with the black pieces. Let's go straight to the game and see what happens. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, or MVL as friends or pretty much everybody calls him because his name is way too long to say it all the time. Rated 2754, by the way. I see his rating doesn't show up on the screen there. White, he goes for 1d4. He's another guy whom I always thought of as an e4 player, but I just checked, and in the last year he's been playing d4 or knight f3 or c4 just as often as d4, a combination of the first three. But he has become very, very flexible, and he goes for 1d4 today. Caruana against d4 tends to go for the Grunfeld or for the Queen's Gambit declined. But he has something else in store today. It's not a surprise because MVL is a huge specialist there himself. So he goes for 2e6. MVL plays knight f3. By the way, it seems like everybody's playing 3 knight f3 these days, and no one's going for the Nimzo Indian knight c3, bishop b4. Not quite sure why. Maybe just following the lead of Vishy Anand, who managed to put a lot of pressure on Magnus Carlsen and pretty much everybody he played afterwards with the move 3 knight f3. After that World Championship match, I mean, where Vishy Anand was employing this move all the time. So knight f3, d5 to c3. This is a position where Caruana has preferred bishop e7 in the past, but today, well, for this game he goes for bishop to b4, the Ragozin. And he joins the ranks of pretty much every top player out there. They're all in love with the Ragozin. Kramnik, Aronian, Anand, Carlsen. Everybody's playing the Ragozin all the time nowadays, it seems like. So it's probably a good move. It's a bit of a hybrid between the Nimzo and the Queen's Gambit declined. And for now, White hasn't been getting all that much. MVL, of course, surprised by this choice since Caruana had never played it. Nevertheless, goes for the main line for now, cd, ed, and bishop to g5. Here, black has a choice between two continuations, which are both very topical. h6, bishop h4, c5 is one, when after e3, black wants to go c4 and grab space on the queen side. This has been very, very popular. The other option is the move Caruana plays in the game, the move knight bd7. Now, the white main line tends to be e3 here, when once again black has a choice between two equally popular continuations. Black's move is the move c5, tending to go queen a5 very quickly, put some pressure on c3, maybe go knight e4, which, yeah, leads to a very complicated game. White has lots of options here. D takes c5, move I've played. Bishop d3 is very possible. Bishop e2, queen c2, any logical move, you name it, and there is a lot of theory attached to it. Maybe in order to escape all that theory, black players have found another way to play recently, or that this has been known for a long time, but it has a lot more exposure recently. h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and knight to e4. Very concrete play, putting pressure on the c3 knight. White has a clever gambit knight d2 here, when black is best advised not to take on c3. But instead they started playing this position. Knight takes g3, hg, or even fg, but hg is more natural. And now c6 or knight b6, say c6. And it seems like, yeah, a lot of world-class players believe this is pretty playable for black, even though the computer will always give white an edge here. The guys don't seem so convinced. However, we'll find out which of these lines Caruana had in mind, because MVL deviates first and decides to surprise his opponent, who surprised him with his opening choice by playing the little played move rook to c1. It's a logical move, of course, reinforcing the knight on c3. It's directed against these ideas with c5, when now d takes c5 is a pretty good option for white. Black to find something else. I think he could still go for g5, knight e4 plan. I don't think anything better for white than knight d2 here, which would lead to a similar position as the one I just showed. But Caruana plays another move which has also been considered as a very good reply to rook c1 for a long time. It's the move c6. Now this is not really in the spirit of the variation, or normally black tries to get in c5, but it's adjusting to the drawbacks of the move rook c1. One of them, believe it or not, is that the a2 pawn is no longer protected, and that can become relevant very quickly. It will be in the game after queen to a5. The other is that if white plays more slowly, let's say a3, bishop d6, in this structure, it doesn't really belong to c1. It should either be on b1, supporting the future minority attack, or it should be after development is finished, bishop d3, queen c2, on e1 or d1 to help, well, more on e1 than d1, to help play in the center. So black can get away with playing a bit more slowly, going c6, retreating his bishop, because a rook on c1 does not really fit into white's setup. MVL, of course, aware of all that stuff, decides not to go a3, chase his bishop away, but instead just continue developing, because, yeah, with slow play the bishop wouldn't be doing all that much on a5. On b4, I'm sorry. Said a5 because that's where black queen goes, and that's the other idea of c6, trying to justify his setup. Attacking the a2 pawn and unpinning this knight, which could jump into e4. White is nothing better than to continue development with bishop to d3. It would be too late to go a3 now because of bishop takes c3, and rook takes c3, runs into knight e4. Not a good idea for white. And of course, all of this is theory and known to MVL, who played bishop d3 here. And Caruana, who's new to this line, probably or maybe not familiar with all the sidelines like this one, decided not to test his opponent and did not play the critical move here, queen takes a2. This is a pawn sacrifice. It's also a theory. There have been games here. Castles, queen a5, knight to e5. And white gets very good compensation for the pawn. It's trying to build an initiative on the king side very, very quickly. However, if black knows what he's doing, at least according to MVL, he said at the press conference that this is a forced draw. I'm not sure if it's a forced draw. It becomes very complicated, but we can take MVL's word for it that black is okay here. I believe this is the line they've been playing with huge complications. Caruana, not interested in any of this, instead goes for the other logical move, knight to e4. Not only attacking c3, but also trying to separate white's two bishops. White has nothing better here than to castle kingside. By the way, in these always be careful not to blunder your bishop on g5 with something like this. It has happened. So castle kingside, black is best advised not to take this knight c3, bc, bishop c3. Well, it's queen c2, black is in trouble already. Bishop b4 can probably even be met with bishop takes h7. It's just nothing you would do here. Even if bishop h7 doesn't work, this pawn grab would lose too much time. So instead, Caruana's idea was to take the bishop on g5, and after knight takes g5, we have the material balance and structure that will define the rest of the game. Black managed to get the two bishops, but white got rid of his so-called bad bishop because his pawns were on the same color, and white is gonna try to build an initiative on the king side mainly. Not so much with queen h5, even though if he's allowed to, he would do that as well. But the typical plan here is to go transfer this knight to e5 and then support it with f4. That's what we're gonna see in the game, at least after black played knight f6. h6 was discussed, but then the other move mentioned, queen h5, is an option for white, which Caruana seemed keen to avoid. Knight to f6, queen to c2. Very useful move, not only developing, but also provoking black to show his hand what he wants to do with his kingside pawns. Because of course castles out of the question, since h7 would be under attack. So black goes h6, I think g6 here, yeah. It's probably just too slow. White would go f4, f5, start an attack immediately. So h6, knight to f3. But having this pawn on h6 is a bit of a mixed blessing in these positions. I'll talk about it later when it becomes more concrete. But with a pawn on h6, it's normally very hard to get rid of a knight on e5, because you can never kick it away with f6, since that would lead to some pretty ugly weaknesses on the light squares, if you go both h6 and f6. Well, if you had the pawn on h7 and the other pawn on g6, would be a bit of a different story. So not so easy to play this position with black. Bishop d6 is very logical. The bishop had nothing more to do on b4 and therefore retreats to its best square on d6. And MVL wastes no time in putting his knight where he wants it, knight to e5. However, turns out this was a bit premature and he's going to have to retrace his steps because black has the very strong and typical move knight g4 here, which was played. Attacking this knight, you don't want to exchange it after knight g4, bishop g4. The position is just equal. And you can't go f4 because it takes e3. It's a very typical idea. In these Queen's Gambit decline positions, keep it in mind. If white goes knight e5 and you can go knight g4, tends to be a good idea. However, nothing is lost for white because after knight g4, he just retreated. And he's planning to go h3 and then bring the knight back to e5. Which, by the way, you can't fight so easily with a move like queen to c7 because there's always tactics in the air. Here, for example, knight to b5 would be quite unpleasant. So Caruana saw then retreating. I don't think he was really hoping for a move repetition, knight e5. But MVL played the move h3 and prepared knight e5. Once again, can't really be stopped with queen c7 because of knight b5. So black castled, the knight jumps back to e5 now that knight g4 is no longer possible. And I think we can take stock here for a moment. I would argue that white has won the opening battle. This knight is very, very powerful once it's supported with f4, and it can be followed up by trying to start a kingside attack with g4 and g5 in the air. Well, for black it's very hard to organize his pieces and get counterplay. The main problem is it's very hard to fight against this knight. Knight d7, f4. And as I mentioned, these f6 ideas no longer really work because it always leads to too many weaknesses. Here would just lose after bishop h7, king h8, knight g6. But even if that's not there, it's just very hard to get rid of that knight. So Caruana plays a useful move, plays a6, taking the b5 square under control and preparing to gain some counterplay, or at least complicate the position a bit with c5. MVL doesn't object and he goes f4, of course, according to plan, allowing c5. However, you could argue for the move knight to a4, which was mentioned by Caruana at the press conference, and I think it's an excellent move, just stopping c5 for good. And, well, f4 doesn't run away. White can, even if he wants to follow up with a3, b4 later. But I think white is better here. I think the opening has gone a bit wrong for Fabiano Caruana, and maybe it can be traced back all the way to not grabbing the pawn on a2, which probably is critical in this line. Still, a lot of play, of course, to come after a6. White played f4 as mentioned, and black at least got in c5, which is not a huge accomplishment, but it does open the position a little bit. g4 was played, logical. However, also exposing the king, which will be a topic later. cd4, e4. And yeah, white is still, I think, a bit better because this knight is so powerful. But this king is a little bit exposed, and also the d4 pawn, while easy to defend for now at least requires some attention. So this structure is more tricky to play for white than the one with pawns on c6 and e3, which he could have maintained by going knight to a4. Still, white has a pleasant position. Bishop to e6 was played. Not really afraid of f5, because white ideally would not want to go f5 unless it yields direct benefits. And he's trying to connect his rooks, put the rooks probably on c8 and e8. So far, all very logical, but here MVL commits a very serious mistake. He plays a move queen to b3. Of course, this is based on some concrete calculations. He missed something in the lines later. But if we look at it philosophically, it also feels wrong to go queen b3. Not sure if that's really philosophy, but who cares. Feels like this queen should be on the king side, supporting the white build-up here. Queen g2 was discussed by the players at the press conference. Queen g2 is preferred by the computer. King h1 was also mentioned. In general, all these moves that help white keeping control on the king side look like they lead to a quite pleasant position. Maybe a small edge, even though having gotten in c5, cd4, I don't think black's position is too bad anymore. Still, queen g2 or queen f2 do look very logical. However, black would continue his setup and hope that g5 is not really a problem. but it's gonna be not so easy to play this position. Instead, queen b3 was played with a concrete idea that I mentioned. It doesn't work. First concrete idea is to take this pawn, but b5, of course, not a surprise. But MVL was relying on the move f5 here and trying to win a pawn on d5. However, he did miss a very nice Zwischenzug played by Caruana, the move queen to b6, and that really ruins white's idea completely, because now you can't take on e6 due to queen takes d4 followed by queen e5, and black is winning. You can't protect the d4 pawn with something like knight e2 either, because of the bishop e5 you can't recapture due to the pin. So white only has one move, which is to f3, and to retreat this pride of his position from e5 back to f3 is a sign that things have gone wrong. Now all of a sudden this bishop is very strong and the white king looks a bit exposed. So this tactical operation has failed. Black went bishop c8. When the question is, why can't white take on d5? This wasn't even mentioned by the players at the press conference. Probably after d5 they just saw queen takes d5, bishop b7. Stop calculating here because this position is absolutely terrible for white. For example, queen b3, rook ae8, and this, well, black is just winning here. Look at these bishops staring down the important diagonals. The white king completely lacks shelter. Rook e3 is threatened. Just doesn't work at all for white. But we had one very clever resource given by the computer, which is in this position not to recapture, but instead play bishop e4, planning to go bishop takes d5, which would be a different story. And turns out this is quite possible. The computer spits out some crazy variations here, which in the end lead to equality. And I'm not sure what would happen had this appeared over the board. Knight to c7 is the main computer move. Of course, now bishop a8, knight a8 doesn't work, but white to c6 now goes after this bishop. B8, rook takes d6. And for the moment, white is a pawn up with a weak king. Black can use that by playing another clever move, knight e8, attacking this rook, which can't really move. And after bishop takes a8, d6, once again with a threat, white has to parry it, king g2, knight f6. Turns out that black has enough compensation. At the moment he's threatening bishop takes f5, but the computer, as it often does in these sharp variations, gives the assessment 0-0-0 after knight e5, saying the position is equal. And who am I to doubt him? So this might have been the best bet for MVL to stay in the game, but during an actual game I think it's very hard to even consider the move bishop e4. And so he chose a move on general grounds, king to g2. Now bishop b7, black has everything covered, and things have gone very, very wrong for white. His queen is on the wrong side of the board, he had to retreat knight from e5, and you can see this king really does not have a lot of shelter. So white has to think about equality here and nothing else. a4 was discussed by the player, but then black also has a bunch of tempting options. Just b4. Knight to a4 was played in the game. Very logical move, bring this knight over to c5, and yeah, trying to at least use this newly generated weak square on c5. Queen a7, newly generated, it makes sense, but after b5, well, this square has been a bit weakened. Queen a7, knight c5. However, the weakness of this square is not the main factor in the position. Main factor is the weak white king. And after rook a8, it also turns out that this knight can't really be supported or maintained there. One key line given by both players, a3, trying to cement the knight with b4. When white goes knight to e4, b4, and the very nasty move, queen to b8. Once again, eyeing this square in close proximity to white's king, threatening bishop takes c5. There's nothing white can do about it. Knight looks like a useful little shot, but it's countered by the very, very strong bishop takes b4, and black wins. Queen b4, queen g3 check. Say king h1. Rook takes c1, queen f8, king h7, and after rook takes c1, knight f2 is checkmate. So long as you can't maintain your knight on c5, and MVL's best bet was to just exchange it for the passive black bishop. Not allowed to do, but this was his best chance, simplifying the position, creating opposite color bishops. White is a little worse, but he has chances of surviving here after a4, b4, a5. This was mentioned by MVL. Yeah, black is better, but there's still a lot to play for. Instead, yeah, he did not want to admit sort of strategic defeat so easily and went for the move a4 here. But that is refuted with very powerful and clear play by Fabiano Caruana. a4, in my opinion, the decisive mistake. After this, there is no way back for white. Bishop takes c5, of course, eliminating this guy. D takes c. And now the star move. Rook takes c5 was good, but Caruana plays a move that's even better. The move d4, freeing all his pieces, really. We see this diagonal is opened, this knight is pinned. And also the black knight after d4 gets some very, very tempting routes to the towards the white king. So after d4, I believe the position already can no longer be saved. A takes b5, logical. The computer spits out the crazy move queen b8 here, but I've already read out enough computer lines in this video, so I won't bother you with it. But that seemed to be winning, queen b8. But a takes b5 is very, very strong as well. Queen takes b5. Caruana from here on, his position is just easier to play, and he makes natural moves, not always a computer move, but keeps the position, and his pieces are just so active potentially, and the white king will never have any shelter again, that it's very, very hard to protect himself. Bishop c6, logical, stops c6, queen b6, queen d7. Of course, you keep the queens on the board here. Now, knight d5 is a huge, huge threat. King to g1, and I'm really impressed with the next move. Knight d5 was good here, planning to go knight e3, but Caruana follows the principle, invite everybody to the party, goes rook f8, no hurry whatsoever, activates his last passive piece, threatening rook e3, and there's really not much white can do. He goes rook ce1, rook e3 had to be stopped. Once again, very clear play, rook takes e1. Pretty much at every move here, knight d5 is a good option, but I really like the of Caruana's play here. Rook takes e1, knight takes e1, and in the same spirit, not rushing with knight d5, rook e8, once again, improving his worst piece. The black initiative is just so strong, it can develop extremely slowly, and there's not much white can do about it. Now there's a lot of threats in the air once again. Knight d5 is always there. Queen d5, rook e3. It's just, yeah, you pay a price for exposing your king. Of course, all this f4, g4 stuff was very, very correct in the given situation, but pawns do never move back, and here it went badly wrong. Not that white is a pawn up, but it is not a factor at all, because these pawns are way too far away from queening. So the position can't be defended. MVL tries knight to g2. There were good alternatives. Bishop is well met. Knight d5, bishop d5, queen d5. Something very bad would happen on this diagonal. Or after knight f3, d3. Black army is just too strong and too coordinated. White is losing. Knight g2 was played when, once again, black has more than one good option. Bishop takes g2 was the most direct. King g2, queen d5 check. King h2, rook e3. Once again, the remaining black pieces are just too strong. Queen e5 is a threat. Of course, rook takes d3 is a threat, and white can pretty much resign here. Instead, Caruana maybe didn't like bishop b5 here. Instead, Caruana found another way, which is also very strong, and that's sometimes the thing. If you have too many options and spend too much time calculating them for a clear win, you might get distracted. And once you see one good option, that really is good enough here. Knight d5, queen b3, knight to e3. Keeping it simple, I'm sure Caruana had correctly that his threats are still overwhelming here, even in this simplified situation. 3 threats. e2, queen to d4, and the nastiest one, queen to c7 and queen g3. MVL manages to parry 2 of them, but not all. Queen d4 stops e2 and queen d4. Queen c7 is still good. Queen g3 is a massive threat. Only way to stop that is queen to f4. When after queen takes f4, rook takes f4. White almost made it, but not quite, because of course all of this was planned from afar. Black still has his e-pawn, and the e-pawn costs white a piece. e2 has to be taken, because else this pawn would not remain a pawn much longer. Bishop e2, rook takes e2, and this endgame is a very easy win for black. With his extra piece, and white can't even keep his pieces for his pawns for very long. Rook b4 was played, b4 was not an improvement. Anything wins, just bring the king, for example. So rook b4, rook g2 check, king f1, c2. And MVL had to resign. He's losing the c5 pawn. He is a piece down. No further resistance is possible. They are also past the time control. So the French number 1 resigned. Fabiano Caruana wins his second game in a row and moves to 3 out of 4. We'll have a look at the standings in a second. Let's briefly recap the highlights. I liked MVL's opening. I think he got a good position after knight e5, a6. I like knight a4, but also the way he for c5, g4 looked quite promising for white. But then after queen b3, this is really the one big turning point of the game. It all started going downhill. Queen had to be kept closer to the king. Queen b3, b5, and the big turn after f5. Black had the resource queen b6, very cleverly extricating himself from the troubles. And after sorry, white has to worry about equality. His best shot was knight d5, knight d5 to e4. After he didn't do that, he got gradually outplayed. Very strong, logical finish by Fabiano Caruana. Played a very good game. Let's have a look at the standings, if I manage to bring them up, of the FIDE Grand Prix. Once again, this is the final leg of the FIDE Grand Prix. The first 2 in the overall rankings of the Grand Prix, not just out of this tournament, but out of the 4 tournaments played, will qualify for the candidates tournament. The favorites to do so are Fabiano Caruana, Yevgeny Tomaszewski, and Hikaru Nakamura. We see Caruana is in the sole lead now with 3 out of 4. Tomaszewski and Nakamura both on 50%. Dominguez and Svidler in pursuit of Caruana in this tournament, but they have few chances to qualify for the overall thing. Anyway, only 4 rounds played. There's a lot of play left. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.